Evelyn had recently arrived at St. Bridget's Convent, a place where the silence was as thick as the heavy stone walls. The air always felt heavy with the weight of discipline, devotion, and the unspoken vows of purity that the women who entered these walls were expected to uphold. The small, stark room she was assigned became her refuge. It was a space where she could retreat from the judgments of others and try to make sense of her complicated feelings. She had been raised in an environment that demanded perfection, yet she was still grappling with the overwhelming sense of loneliness. The sense of connection she sought felt elusive. One evening, after a long, tiring day of rituals and prayers, Evelyn felt the need to escape for a while, if only for a few minutes. She locked the door behind her, allowing herself a forbidden moment of relief. She had brought with her something small, a keepsake from her past life, an object of intimacy. When she closed her eyes, it grounded her, and for a brief, fleeting moment, she could pretend she wasn't bound by the heavy expectations of her vows. The serenity of Evelyn's moment of solitude shattered when the door to the shower room creaked open. Sister Teresa, one of the older and more revered members of the convent, had entered unexpectedly. She had come to check the facilities, but instead she found Evelyn in a vulnerable and private act. Teresa froze. Evelyn, horrified by the intrusion, tried to conceal what she was doing, but it was too late. Teresa had seen it all. Instead of immediately reacting with anger, Teresa's expression softened. There was a flicker of understanding in her eyes, a curiosity that Evelyn did not expect. Evelyn's heart raced as she tried to gather her composure. Teresa, a woman who had always seemed so composed and unwavering in her faith, was now standing before her, seemingly unfazed by what she had just witnessed. The air between them felt charged, full of unspoken tension. Rather than scold Evelyn, Teresa's response was almost comforting. She spoke softly, reassuring Evelyn that there was no sin in her actions, no fault in her desire. Teresa offered her understanding and warmth, something that Evelyn had longed for in the cold, structured life of the convent. Teresa began to explain that sexual feelings weren't inherently wrong, and that perhaps it was Evelyn's guilt that was truly sinful. She suggested that what she had done was a natural part of being human, and instead of punishment, what was needed was understanding, closeness, and purification. Evelyn, still rattled by the encounter, didn't fully understand what Teresa was offering, but in that moment of isolation and vulnerability, Teresa seemed like a lifeline. Teresa's words, though unorthodox, made Evelyn feel seen and understood in a way she had never experienced before, and so she listened. Little did she know, Teresa had ulterior motives for offering such compassion. Teresa's influence over Evelyn, Isabel, and Rose deepened under the guise of spiritual guidance. The once strict rituals of the convent now blended with Teresa's increasingly intimate interpretations of faith. Teresa taught that emotional and physical connections weren't sinful, but rather part of the divine design, and that each woman needed to experience them to become whole. Her words were soothing, her touch soft, and her presence magnetic. As her influence grew, Teresa's manipulation became more evident. She positioned herself as their sole source of salvation, subtly making it clear that they could not find peace without her. The relationship, once founded on trust, shifted into a dangerous dependency. When Evelyn, Isabel, or Rose began to question the boundaries, Teresa would gently yet firmly remind them that it was only through her wisdom that they could truly achieve spiritual growth. She planted seeds of doubt about their worthiness and guilt. Her carefully chosen words and actions began to distort their perceptions, making them feel as if their own desires were the cause of their suffering. Teresa expertly twisted their thoughts, making them believe they needed her to be forgiven and purified. By exploiting their vulnerability and the isolation of convent life, she ensured they felt unable to challenge her authority. As Teresa's manipulation deepened, she began introducing Evelyn, Isabel, and Rose to a path that was increasingly hidden from the convent's official doctrine. She led them into secretive spaces within the convent, hidden chapels, old abandoned rooms, and secluded parts of the grounds. There, she would speak about a different kind of spirituality, one that mixed the sacred with the profane, where emotional and physical closeness were seen as necessary steps towards spiritual purity. These secret encounters started innocuously enough. At first, they involved discussions of faith and the exploration of one's inner self. But soon, Teresa began pushing the boundaries further. She spoke of how human connection, both emotional and physical, was the ultimate expression of God's love. She emphasized the idea that such connections were necessary for spiritual cleansing. Over time, these practices became more intimate, testing the limits of what was considered acceptable in their vows. Evelyn, Isabel and Rose, feeling isolated and desperate for Teresa's validation, followed her guidance without question. They believed that this was a hidden, higher calling that no one else could understand, an exclusive path that Teresa had revealed to them, one that promised divine enlightenment. Teresa's influence grew from just a one-on-one relationship with the young women into something far more insidious. She began to recruit other vulnerable members of the convent, encouraging them to embrace her teachings. Those who seemed isolated, questioning their vows, or struggling with feelings of guilt were gradually pulled into Teresa's web. As her circle grew, so did her power. She framed herself as a healer of souls, someone who could guide them through their most intimate struggles and desires. Teresa created a sense of community among the women who followed her, uniting them under a false sense of purpose. There was a sense of belonging that came with being a part of Teresa's teachings, and the women began to feel that they were part of something far greater than themselves. Teresa convinced them that they were destined for something special, a higher calling that went beyond the convent's traditional religious practices. Her control over the women was absolute. She knew how to push their emotional buttons, how to exploit their doubts, and how to make them believe that without her, they would never be truly whole. The more they followed her, the more Teresa's hold over them solidified. She had become the spiritual leader in their lives, someone they could not question or live without. The lives of Evelyn, Isabel, and Rose became increasingly tense as they tried to maintain their carefully constructed facades. Their once innocent daily rituals now felt like a burden, every glance, every whispered word, and every moment of quiet bringing with it the fear of being discovered. The once welcoming walls of St. Bridget's had become a prison where trust was eroded and secrets weighed heavily on their shoulders. The secrecy of their relationship with Teresa required an immense amount of effort to sustain. Their interactions, once warm and supportive, were now laced with tension. Each of them silently feared the consequences of exposure. What would happen to their lives if anyone learned the truth? The bond they shared with Teresa began to feel suffocating. They knew that breaking their vows and living under the guise of a spirituality that mixed the sacred with the profane was a dangerous game, yet they couldn't stop. Evelyn, once strong in her faith, began to question everything. The guilt of betraying her vows gnawed at her daily. She had moments where she felt a deep, gnawing anxiety, unable to sleep, her thoughts endlessly spiraling around what she had become involved in. Isabel, more outwardly composed, started showing signs of nervousness. She would glance around nervously, flinching at the slightest sound of footsteps. Rose, the youngest and most vulnerable, felt utterly consumed by fear. She had moments of tears, wondering how she could continue to live a lie. But Teresa's influence remained strong. Her promises of spiritual enlightenment and comfort kept them tied to her cause. As their emotional strain grew, they began to isolate themselves even further from the rest of the convent. The secrecy began to take a toll on their relationships with the other nuns. The once solid sisterhood now felt fragile, and any attempt to interact with others was tainted by the fear that someone would see through their carefully constructed masks. The unrelenting strain on the young women's lives would soon be overshadowed by an external force: Detective Samuel Carter. His arrival at the convent was prompted by a series of anonymous tips, whispers of strange behavior, isolated individuals, and reports of unusual gatherings within the convent grounds. The tension surrounding Teresa and her inner circle had become too much to ignore, and rumors began to circulate in the surrounding town. Carter was a seasoned investigator, known for his thoroughness and patience. He arrived at the convent under the guise of routine inquiry, but it quickly became clear that something much darker was at play. His first approach was subtle. He began speaking with various nuns about their work, the general atmosphere at the convent, and their personal lives. Most of the older sisters were cooperative, and many spoke highly of Teresa, praising her wisdom, but Carter was not convinced. When he began speaking to the younger nuns, especially Evelyn, Isabel, and Rose, he noticed something was off. There were subtle signs of distress in their behavior. Their eyes darted nervously when asked about their daily routines, and they grew visibly uncomfortable when the subject of Teresa was brought up. Carter's instincts told him that something deeper was at play. He continued to dig, all the while careful not to alert Teresa to his suspicions. The more he observed, the clearer it became that Teresa held sway over the younger women, but the nature of her influence was murky. Was it spiritual, or was it something darker, more insidious? He couldn't yet put his finger on it, but he knew he had had to press forward. The pressure was mounting on Evelyn, Isabel, and Rose. The secret meetings with Teresa, once shrouded in a sense of empowerment and belonging, now felt like a heavy burden they could no longer carry. The fear of discovery, the constant anxiety, and the guilt of their actions were beginning to break them down. The closer the investigation came to uncovering the truth, the more their composure cracked. Evelyn, once the most steadfast, found herself questioning the very foundation of her beliefs. She had trusted Teresa, believed in her message, and yet, now, nothing seemed right. The once appealing promises of spiritual enlightenment now felt like chains, shackling her to something darker than she ever imagined. Isabel, always the more rational one, started experiencing nightmares. Her once steady hand trembled at the simplest task, and she avoided direct contact with others, her every move fraught with paranoia. Rose, the youngest and most vulnerable, was the first to break. She could no longer carry the weight of the secrecy. In the dead of night, she went to Detective Carter and confessed everything: how Teresa had preyed on their vulnerabilities, how they had been manipulated into believing that their connection to her was the key to their spiritual salvation. She recounted how Teresa had slowly twisted their thoughts and made them feel as if they had no choice but to follow her path. Rose's confession shattered the fragile trust the women had in Teresa, but it also began the unraveling of the entire scheme. With Rose's words, the detective had enough to press forward with a more intense investigation. It was a moment of great relief for Rose, but also a moment of deep shame, as she now had to live with the knowledge of what she had allowed to happen. The point of no return had arrived. Evelyn, Isabel, and Rose, each grappling with the emotional weight of their actions, could no longer ignore the tension that had been building for months. Their lives, once full of clarity and purpose within the convent, now felt utterly fractured by their entanglement with Teresa and her manipulative influence. The spiritual unity they had sought through their vows had been replaced by a suffocating atmosphere of fear, secrecy, and guilt. Evelyn, the one who had initially shown the most confidence in Teresa's cause, had become emotionally and spiritually drained. The idealistic promises that Teresa had made about spiritual growth and enlightenment had become a bitter, hollow lie. Evelyn's personal faith was in tatters. Every day she wrestled with feelings of guilt for betraying her vows, for abandoning the very ideals of purity she had once revered. Her internal conflict had reached a point where she could no longer sleep, could no longer pray with sincerity. The longer she stayed within the web of secrecy, the more she felt like she was losing herself. Isabel, who had always been more rational and independent, was beginning to show signs of paranoia. She had been the most skeptical of Teresa from the beginning, but as time went on, Teresa's grip on the group only tightened. Isabel had tried to remain detached, to maintain some semblance of control, but her calm facade cracked when she started having vivid dreams and flashes of fear. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, perhaps the community, was starting to see through the facade, and she feared the consequences. Her rational mind could no longer deny the damage that had been done. Rose, the youngest of the three, had always been vulnerable to Teresa's charisma, but the emotional toll was too much for her. The weight of what they had been doing, lying, manipulating, deceiving others, and abandoning their spiritual commitments, was overwhelming. In moments of solitude, Rose would break down in tears, unsure of who she was anymore. She felt trapped, not just by the secrets, but by the guilt of having hurt the other women in the convent. This guilt consumed her, and she could no longer bear it. Eventually, each of them hit their personal breaking points. Evelyn, in an emotional breakdown, admitted to Isabel that she couldn't continue living this double life. Isabel confessed that she too was ready to come clean, but it was Rose, the most vulnerable, who acted first. She could not bear the emotional weight any longer. She sought out Detective Samuel Carter, the investigator who had been quietly probing the convent for some time. Rose, desperate for release, confessed everything. Her words shattered the silence. Rose's confession marked the tipping point. No longer could the truth be hidden. Detective Carter, who had been methodically piecing together the strange circumstances around the convent, now had the missing piece to the puzzle. He acted swiftly, interviewing Evelyn and Isabel, who, though reluctant at first, were eventually compelled to tell the truth. Their testimonies corroborated Rose's confession. They spoke of Teresa's slow and methodical manipulation, how she had preyed upon their weaknesses and insecurities to create a false sense of spiritual closeness. They explained how Teresa's power had grown and how over time they had come to believe that the path they were following was one of divine inspiration, even as they unknowingly participated in the control and exploitation of others. Evelyn described her initial idealism, her desire to make a real difference in the world, only to be drawn into something darker. Isabel explained how she had initially distanced herself from Teresa's manipulations, only to be gradually drawn in through subtle emotional coercion. Detective Carter's investigation now had concrete evidence of Teresa's psychological manipulation, the emotional abuse, and the exploitative tactics she had employed to maintain control over the women. The once revered figure, who had been thought of as a beacon of wisdom and guidance, was now exposed for what she truly was: a predator. The truth came to light not only through the women's confessions, but also through gathered documents, letters, and testimonies from others in the convent who had noticed Teresa's rising influence. As the pieces came together, it became clear that Teresa had orchestrated this entire scheme under the guise of spiritual guidance, and the women's lives had been irrevocably changed. The aftermath of the truth coming out was swift and devastating. The scandal shook not only the convent but the entire community. The once esteemed St. Bridget's Convent, a symbol of faith and purity, was now viewed with suspicion and horror. The nuns who had followed Teresa's teachings were questioned, and many found themselves facing accusations not just of being manipulated, but of complicity. Evelyn, Isabel, and Rose, despite being victims in this tragic scheme, found themselves under a harsh public spotlight. While some individuals expressed empathy, many others viewed them with disdain. Their decision to follow Teresa, even if manipulated, left them vulnerable to harsh judgment. The other nuns in the convent distanced themselves from the women, fearful of being associated with the scandal. The emotional toll on the women was immense. Evelyn, who had once been so resolute in her faith, now found herself publicly humiliated and uncertain about where her life would go from here. Isabel, the rational one, tried to maintain composure but was also haunted by the whispers and stares of those who saw her as weak or duplicitous. Rose, who had once looked up to Teresa as a mentor, now faced the shame of her involvement. The weight of their past actions, despite being manipulated, became something they could not easily escape. The convent was shut down immediately, its doors sealed. The few remaining sisters had to leave, and the place that had once been their home became a symbol of corruption. Father Michael, the spiritual head of the convent, was also implicated for failing to see what was happening under his watch. He was forced to resign, and his leadership was forever tarnished by his inability to recognize the danger lurking within his own walls. The media coverage of the scandal spread quickly, and the once storied history of St. Bridget's was now associated with exploitation, manipulation, and deceit. The fallout spread beyond the walls of the convent, leaving the community reeling from the revelation that a trusted figure had been responsible for causing so much harm. Teresa's trial became a spectacle, with the public and media clamoring for answers. In the courtroom, the women took the stand to testify against Teresa, recounting the psychological manipulation and coercion they had suffered. Evelyn, Isabel, and Rose each spoke with varying levels of emotion, some struggling to maintain composure while others seemed to speak with a sense of relief, finally shedding the weight of their silence. Teresa, once a revered leader, was now a defendant, sitting in the dock with an air of defiance. She denied all accusations, claiming that she had only sought to help the women find their true spiritual selves. Her defense was built around the idea that she had been misunderstood, that her teachings had been misinterpreted. However, the mountain of evidence stacked against her, from testimonies to documentation of the emotional manipulation, was overwhelming. The trial was a grueling process, but in the end, the verdict was clear. Teresa was convicted of multiple counts of emotional abuse, manipulation, and coercion. She was sentenced to prison, and while this brought some semblance of justice, it did little to repair the damage done to the women's lives. In the wake of the trial, the women were left to rebuild their shattered lives. Each had been scarred in different ways, and while the conviction of Teresa offered some closure, it did not undo the years of psychological trauma they had endured. Evelyn, Isabel, and Rose faced their own personal battles in trying to reclaim their identities, their dignity, and their faith. Evelyn, in an effort to make amends for her past, began working with survivors of emotional abuse, hoping to give back to the community that had once supported her. Isabel, the most pragmatic of the three, became an advocate for women's rights, working specifically to address psychological manipulation and coercion in religious settings. Rose, the youngest, sought a quieter life, eventually leaving the public eye to find peace in a small town, far away from the media frenzy that had once consumed her. The women sought therapy, attended support groups, and worked together to understand the complex layers of manipulation they had endured. They found healing not in erasing the past, but in acknowledging it and using their experiences to help others who had suffered similar fates. The emotional scars they carried were deep, but over time, they learned to forgive themselves. The journey to healing was long and difficult, but they found solace in the fact that they were no longer under Teresa's control. St. Bridget's Convent, once a revered institution, became a symbol of abuse and manipulation. The community no longer saw the convent as a sacred place but as a cautionary tale. The church distanced itself from the scandal, and the building itself was abandoned. The crumbling walls of the convent, once a symbol of purity and piety, now stood as a monument to betrayal and broken trust. The legacy of Teresa's manipulation lived on in the collective memory of the community. Her actions served as a grim reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, especially within the confines of religious institutions. The convent's downfall was not only a failure of leadership, but a failure of trust that had been manipulated, twisted, and ultimately destroyed. For the women who had been involved, the legacy of St. Bridget's was a bitter one. They had been betrayed by someone they had trusted, and in doing so, had lost a part of themselves, but they had also learned powerful lessons about resilience, autonomy, and the importance of standing up for oneself in the face of injustice. Years after the scandal had subsided, the women found themselves reflecting on their past experiences. Evelyn, Isabel, and Rose, though deeply affected by the events, had come to terms with their journey. They understood that while they could never completely erase the pain or the trauma, they could learn from it and use it to guide others. Evelyn, now a counselor for survivors of emotional abuse, found healing in helping others reclaim their lives. Isabel, now an advocate, focused on raising awareness about psychological manipulation and its impact on women. Rose, in her quiet life, learned to forgive herself and find peace with her past. The story of St. Bridget's Convent remained in their hearts, but it no longer defined them. They had taken back their lives, their voices, and their strength. Their final reflection was not one of bitterness, but of understanding the lessons they had learned, the scars they bore, and the value of reclaiming their power. The legacy of St. Bridget's was not just one of tragedy, but also of survival. Through their pain, they had become stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. Their final reflection was not on the darkness of their past, but on the light they had found in reclaiming their autonomy and rebuilding their lives.